This week in Nigeria history takes us back 59 years to January 4, 1967, where on Aburi we stand. The background to the Aburi Accords had been set up by the coup and the counter-coup that had first seen mostly northern leaders killed by soldiers mostly Igbo in origin, and then the July 1966 counter-coup that saw the then end of state who had come into power after the first coup. That was General Aguiyi Ironsi. And his soldiers, his lieutenants, and killed by mostly northern soldiers. The resulting crisis and ethnic distrust had built up to an impasse, which saw the Eastern region government threaten secession. And to resolve this, of course, there was a need to hold a meeting. And as the leaders at that time, the leader of the Eastern region, Colonel Ojukwu, he did not feel safe coming to Lagos. And of course, the federal government reiterated their own that the president, then the head of state rather, the head of state Yakubu Gowon didn't feel safe going to Enugu either. Who will step in but Ghanaian leader, another operator, another literary general, Joseph Otto Ankara. I don't know what was going on there, where everybody seemed to be led by literary general. Thank you for democracy. Anyways, the Ghanaian head of state then offered to host people at Aburi, and that's Aburi in Ghana. And so on January 4th and 5th, the meeting took place. The present day, largely apart from the other military governors, it was really a showdown between Yakubu Gowon and the military governor of the Eastern region, that was Ojukwu. And despite the fact that it was supposed to be a showdown, there were two different approaches, right, between the two parties. The federal government came with a very lax vibe, a relaxed, chilled vibe, whereas the Eastern Party, they came with a more serious, professional vibe. You should saying Ojukwu came with his own, like, advisors, legal experts, secretaries, political secretaries, people who were basically going to give him proper advice on these things, whereas the federal government came with, vibes, they came that, oh, this was going to be a chill discussion. We just basically what they wanted was they wanted one nation. That's what the federal government come and said. They just felt, oh, we'll come here, we'll just, we'll talk, and we'll settle everything, and there'll be no issue. But because Ojuku, they had a different desire from the start. They didn't want a one nation thing in a way because of you can debate or quibble over whether it's legitimate or not. The grievances they had period to the 1960 after the coup and even periods to that, but they came with the understanding that they wanted the Eastern region to be sovereign to an extent. At least they should have ability to control their resources, their security, and various other things that kept at least where they felt were being impeded on by and stampeded on by the various other regions. Now, what they basically did was just to ensure that the wording and the phrasing of their demands were such that the federal government, if they had their legal experts, would have seen through it and seen the repercussion. But because they didn't come with the same preparation, obviously there was going to be what Ojukwu eventually proposed that got through was things that if the federal government had their own experts, they would have seen through it and they would have understood the implications of it. Anyways, the agreement that eventually came into place was that the federal government agreed, they signed an agreement that included that each region, there will be a drawing apart. Basically, that was the phrase they used, a drawing apart to avoid further frictions and killings. Now, this drawing apart will, of course, involve each region then controlling their own security, their own resources and governance. And this drawing apart, in essence, was basically, as the federal government saw it, it was something that was fine because they felt it was going to also, and as long as if it's just drawing apart, as long as the country remains the country, you can draw apart as you want. So that's what they felt it was like. And then the other point that they also even let them feel okay, it was still fine that the Eastern region was still there was that they agreed, all the parties agreed that the Supreme Military Council, which was basically the ruling the ruling committee in place over the country. So rather than, in as much as the head of state, that was Yakubu Gowon, was in place, because due to it being a military regime, there was also a Supreme Military Council over where the head of state was basically like the chairman of it. And that Supreme Military Council was the one that brought out decisions. People who were in the Supreme Military Council were like the military governors of each of those regions. So at that time, Nigeria, they had different regions. You had the Midwest region, you had the Northern region, you had the Eastern region. And so the four regions, there were four of them, they were basically involved in making this. They had military governors who were basically involved in making decisions. And so the other point of agreement was that the legislative and executive authority would exist with the Supreme Military Council, but that any decision to be taken, any serious decision that will affect any of the region, requires unanimous approval of all the people on the Supreme Military Council. And so they felt again, because this was the point brought up by Ojukwu, the federal government agreed to it because they felt, okay, it still means you're still partaking in this, and then you're still part of the country, you're not seceding, that's fine. No wahala. But then the real implication of this was just that the first point, which was that there was a drawing apart of the regions, basically allowed for the Eastern region. It's basically recognized it and allowed for it to self-govern, in that they could do whatever they want and they were sovereign in a way that they weren't before. And then the second point was just basically backed it up, that because you say you need unanimous approval from everybody in the committee, it's not necessarily a good thing for like a particular country in which there's a head of state, because it will mean that each region, if they disagree, like if my region, like the Eastern region or the Western region or the Northern region, if they decide, okay, this is what we want to do, and every other region disagrees, they cannot make any impact on the Northern, on that region which has made its own decision, because you need unanimous approval. And since the region has said no, I'm doing my thing like this, you can't change their mind. So in essence, that second point, it just supports the first point of sovereignty, because it just says, okay, there needs to be unanimous approval, and if one person is out, then you can't really impact them. It's basically nullified the head of state's power. That was Yakubu Gowon, and that's even leaving aside the change in the title, which was one of the things they also discussed, from head of state to commander-in-chief of the armed forces, as well as even another thing, previous history between Gowon and Ojukwu, which rather than being, we don't want to use the word subordinate, like Ojukwu being subordinate to Gowon, they were more or less, they basically interacted like peers. And of course, those are subtle things that might influence or affect decision making whenever there's hierarchies to be considered. Anyways, the result of the meeting, of the agreement, was just that Nigeria, after that, based on the Aburi agreement, was less of a federation and more of a confederation. Basically, four states which agreed to be merged together with equal powers. And because of the phrasing and wording used by Ojukwu, the other delegates of the federal government, they did not understand it. They did not, at least, they thought they understood it, but they did not understand the implication. So they were just celebrating that, oh, Nigeria is one, that they achieved what they wanted. Or to Ojukwu, he was just like, are these people, do these people really understand what they've signed? Do these people? But obviously they didn't. And note to self, actually, maybe I studied a legal document. Basically, last point to note for today: get legal experts. Don't make it easy for the wool to be put over your order. It's like no matter how smart you are, there are always phrasing and wordings that can be used legally to, have subtle implications that one might not realize. It's the reason why a lot of people get into so many back and forth and argument on legal decision. Anyways, it was one thing winning the battle at the negotiating table in Aburi, but winning it back home was a different thing, because obviously when Gowon went to the federal government and they had their eyes opened by legal experts, permanent secretaries about the full implications of this agreement, obviously they were wrong. And they realized that this cannot be the case. They cannot let this go on through. So they did what? Well, quote unquote, clarifications, basically. They will make certain clarifications, and among them, we'll come to this later on subsequent dates when they are relevant to those dates. But these clarifications, basically, the major one was that rather than that unanimous requirement for each region, like for each of the military governors for a decision to be taken by the Supreme Military Council, they made it more than to just 3. So that even if one region decides they don't agree with it, as long as the other 3 agree, you can do it. And so that basically nullified the sovereignty clause, and of course was rejected by the Eastern region, and that set us on the way to civil war. Fast forward to January 7, 1970, 3 years later, and that was 56 years ago. The Nigerian Civil War will cease final offensive when General Olusegun Obasanjo leading the 3rd Marine Commando Division, launched Operation Tailwind, bombarding Owerri and Uli. That was one of the final, basically the ending of the war. It was one of the significant, it was the last significant flurry of activity that ended the war. And because it started upon on January 7, by January 9th, Ojukwu had fled to Ivory Coast, handed over power to his vice president at the time. That was Philippe Eviong. And so, vice president of Biafra, that was a short-lived nation of Biafra. And as soon as Ojukwu fled to Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, Philippe Effiong called for a ceasefire to discuss the terms of surrender to the Nigerian army. Of course, I'm sure many people are aware of like General Olusegun Obasanjo, who led that final offensive, who later became the president of basically the first president of the Fourth Republic. That is the Fourth Republic of Nigeria in 1999. But the war ended then on there are differing dates, but likely on the 11th, the surrender was accepted to be 30 months of war. More than conservative estimate, 1 million deaths of million civilians deaths. Some people will go as far as 2 million. All this recorded this well to an extent resulting from the broken agreements. But some people, of course, you can trace it earlier. And by January 11th, 1970, the Nigerian Civil War was over. Nigeria was won again. If you can say it was won, different regions, different people, different cultures and all. It still goes on to today. But in as much as the genesis of the events of the Civil War lay before January 4th, 1967, before the Aburi meeting. And to be fair, I actually don't think the Aburi meeting could have solved any of the issues noted. At best, let's even assume Gowon understood what Ojukwu was proposing. Like the federal government really understood the implications of it. I would expect, and it's reasonable to assume that they would have rejected it outrightly. And as Ojukwu had their own different contrasting objectives, there was unlikely to be any middle ground that would have been wrought and achieved by these two parties because each of them's objectives were different. One wanted sovereignty of their own region, the other one wanted unity, and you can't have both at the same place. But in as much as a lot of the issues that arose then and the sovereignty and the unity thing are still things that people discuss, the underlying factor of this is just the ethnic differences, and those still remain relevant today. There is more integration, sure, thank God for that, but of course biases still remain. You hear it in the comments. Some people utter some of our thoughts, some of our actions. In fact, people vote for, people just vote for people. You're my person now. You're for my tribe. You know all those things. And honestly, there's little to say on this. It's quite obvious, like what we should do. We should judge people by their character, know where they came from, know who they are, know their families. I know there are times you need to make understand, multiple people from this place have done this to you, but that doesn't mean the next person is also going to do the same to you. There's a level of intelligence, let's just use that, intelligence that demands that we understand and evaluate people for who they are. Understand and evaluate people for their ideas, for their actions, for their behavior, and use that as the basis by which we make judgments or cast aspersions on people. It's obvious, honestly, but hey, oh dear, people continue to do what people do. We are all adults. Let's try to act as one. It's quite obvious, but if it's not obvious to you, well, I don't know, man. Anyways, have a wonderful week, everybody. I'll see you next week on this.